Let me ask you something simple. When was the last time you called someone without feeling awkward? No warning, no "can I call" text, just a call. If that question made you uncomfortable, you're not alone. Because Gen Z didn't stop answering calls by accident. They stopped because phone calls feel invasive. To older generations, phone calls meant connection. To Gen Z, they feel like an interruption, an unexpected demand for attention in a world already overflowing with noise. A call doesn't ask, it takes. It demands your time, your tone, your emotional presence immediately. Texting, on the other hand, gives control. Control over timing, control over words, control over emotions. You can pause, think, edit, respond when you're ready. For a generation raised on constant stimulation, that control feels like safety. Psychologists call this asynchronous communication preference. It means Gen Z prefers conversations that don't require real-time emotional performance. Because phone calls don't just communicate information, they communicate mood, tone, energy, expectation, and that's exhausting. Gen Z grew up being watched by algorithms, by peers, by the internet itself. Every word could be screenshotted, every reaction judged. So they learned to curate their responses carefully. Texting allows that curation. Phone calls don't. There's also something deeper. Phone calls remove distance. They make things feel too real, too intimate, too immediate. Texting creates a buffer, a soft wall between emotion and expression. And for a generation navigating anxiety, burnout, and constant comparison, that wall feels necessary. Another reason Gen Z avoids calls is emotional labor. A call requires you to perform presence, to sound interested, to react in real time, to manage silences. Texting doesn't demand that. You can be present without being performative. And let's be honest, most phone calls aren't emergencies anymore. They're small talk, awkward pauses, unclear intentions. Gen Z values efficiency. They want clarity, purpose. If something can be said in one sentence, why turn it into a 10-minute conversation? But this isn't just about convenience, it's about boundaries. Texting lets Gen Z decide when they're available. Phone calls assume availability. And in a culture where burnout is normalized, that assumption feels disrespectful. There's also the fear factor. Many Gen Z individuals associate phone calls with bad news, job rejections, authority figures, unexpected problems. So when the phone rings, the body reacts before the mind does. Heart rate rises, anxiety kicks in. The call becomes a threat instead of a tool. But here's the irony. Gen Z isn't antisocial. They're hyper-aware. They care deeply about how they're perceived. They want to communicate accurately, authentically. And phone calls don't give them enough space to do that safely. Texting gives distance, and distance gives clarity. It allows Gen Z to express themselves without emotional overload, without instant judgment, without pressure to react perfectly. Older generations might see this as avoidance, but psychologically, it's adaptation. Gen Z didn't reject phone calls because they don't care. They rejected them because they care too much. About boundaries, about mental health, about energy. And maybe the real question isn't, why does Gen Z hate phone calls? Maybe it's, why did we normalize instant access to each other in the first place? Because silence isn't disrespect. Delayed replies aren't rejection. And choosing text over calls isn't emotional weakness. Sometimes it's self-protection. Gen Z isn't afraid of connection. They're afraid of losing themselves in it. So they choose communication that lets them stay whole, clear, grounded. And maybe that's not a flaw. Maybe it's the future.